most of you guys, I'm Sid Frede. I've been around for a little while, and we do these clinics each winter. This is the third of 4 we're doing this year. The next one is on a Thursday, and I'm not sure what the date is, but we'll send you an email out to remind you of that one as well. But today we're really going to talk about controlling your throttle along with your rudder. And a couple general things is that we're going to talk about the takeoff process and what's going on as far as the takeoff and why everything goes to the left. And especially tail draggers. We'll talk about why tail draggers especially want to go to the left. So what I handed out today was a description kind of some of the forces that are acting on the airplane. So I'll go through those individually and give you a mini physics lesson, and then we'll talk about what that really means to your airplane. So we've got several things that affect an airplane when we're taking off, and one is torque. Of course, we got this motor, and the motor wants to spin that way. And when the motor spins that way, there's a force that wants to go this way. So if you held onto the propeller and let the plane go free, the plane would just spin around, right? So every time you crank the throttle, the plane wants to lean this way just a little bit. If you crank the throttle really hard, there's going to be a fair amount of force applied to the airplane rotating this way. What that does is it puts more force on this wheel, which essentially acts as a brake. So now the airplane spins like this. So that's one of the factors that's going to make your airplane go to the left. Whether it's a tricycle gear or whether it's a tail dragger, that force is going to be the same when you spin this motor up. And if you jam the throttle, you're really going to put a lot of force on that wheel and you're going to spin around like an ice skater. So that's the torque issue. Now on a tail dragger, which this one is, we've got the wheels, which typically are aligned kind of at the front end of the front of the wing. On a tricycle gear, and the reason the wheels are out there is that the tail wants to be heavy, right? It's a tail dragger, because we've got to drag that tail in order to get rudder control for ground control, because that's where our wheel is to steer. For a tricycle gear, we'll put a wheel up front, and you'll notice that typically the gear is mounted kind of at the center of the wing or a little behind the wing, because we want the wheel to be behind the center of gravity so that the plane wants to tilt down. That allows us to put pressure on the nose wheel, so when we want to steer with the nose wheel, we've got some force on that nose wheel. Also, last time we talked a little bit about having down thrust in the motor for a couple of reasons. Primarily when we're flying, we put a little down thrust in the motor. That tends to want to make the plane go down, and to compensate for that, we put a little trim in our elevator, which makes the plane want to go up. So we've got two forces kind of acting on your plane. One wants to go down, one wants to go up. What you wind up with is a very stable platform going across the sky. If the motor were perfectly aligned with zero thrust, what the wing was perfectly aligned with zero thrust, which the horizontal stab was aligned with perfectly zero thrust, or zero incidence, the plane would keep hunting all the time. It's unstable. So by putting a little down force to bring it down, a little up force to bring it up, now we have a plane going across the sky which is locked in. But that process also, putting a little down force in the motor, gives a little more pressure on that front wheel. When we crank up the throttle, a little down thrust wants to tip us forward just a little bit, which puts more pressure on the steering wheel, which allows us to steer a little bit better. That's rotational force. We call it torque, whatever you want to call it from that standpoint. And they talk about that. The first thing we talk about here is torque. Another issue is prop wash, or it's referred to in here as spiraling slipstream. Well, what does that mean? Well, ideally, and once we're in flight, and we're moving across the sky and our motor's revved up, the flow is fairly linear across the surface of our plane. But when we're sitting on the ground and we fire up the propeller, we create basically a cylindrical column of air spiraling over our airplane. And that column of air comes up and smacks into our rudder. And that's another factor that makes us spin to the left. We've got this slipstream of air that's being generated by the propeller, wants to push us that direction. If you take a look, I think at the last page is a picture of the Corsair on a carrier deck. And it was one of those days when it was almost 100% humidity, so you can see the slipstream in the air. So you can see the spiral that this propeller is creating, and that's sending a spiraling column of air all the way back to the airplane, hitting the rudder, turning left. So that in combination with the braking force on our wheel, we're going left. With the tricycle gear, since we've got our steering wheel on the ground, that really helps stabilize us. That's something that kind of gives us an arrow to point forward, and that's why a tricycle gear is much more stable on the takeoff roll than a tail dragger. But we got some other factors. One factor is called P factor. And I love the description when they talk about P factor. It's the asymmetrical blade effect and asymmetrical disc effect, and an aerodynamic phenomenon experienced in a moving propeller responsible for the asymmetrical relocation of the propeller center of thrust when an aircraft is at high angle of attack. Well, what the hell does that mean? Kind of what it means is that if you take a look at a propeller, it has a pitch to it. This particular propeller is a 2810, so it's got a 10 pitch. What that means is that one rotation of the propeller, in a perfect world, this propeller will move forward 10 inches. It doesn't always happen because other things affect it, but that's the way we respect it. Now if you take a look at the pitch on the propeller, you can see that's a pitch of about a 10 propeller. Well, now a tail dragger sits like this. The propeller is not perpendicular to our line of travel. So what we have now is that the down turning edge of the propeller has a very significant pitch. The upturning edge of the propeller basically has zero pitch. So what we have now is a propeller with a lot of thrust on this side and no thrust on this side. So we added the fact, the braking effect, the torque effect, and what's called the P effect. Every one of our models wants to hang off left. So these forces start to add up. And the last thing we're talking about is the get that page here. The gyroscopic precession. And what does that mean? What that means is that when you have a spinning disc on a shaft and you apply a force to that disc either up, down, left, or right, there will be another force applied 90 degrees of the rotation on that particular disc. So if you take and this is an example they often use in science fairs. There's one downtown at the Kids Science Museum. You've got a bicycle wheel spinning really fast on a shaft. If you take that shaft and try to move the shaft, it's going to make you move another direction. So on a propeller, when we're turning this direction, if we apply a force this direction, there's a force that's going to be applied 90 degrees of rotation this direction. Well, in a tail dragger, we're sitting here taxiing down the runway. We've got braking effect on the wheel. We've got torque effect here. We've got the P factor. And now, when the tail dragger starts to roll up on its mains to taxi out, there's now a force pushing down on the propeller, and there's an equivalent force pushing this way on the propeller. So for a tail dragger, we've got torque effect, we've got braking effect, we've got P factor, and we've got gyroscopic precession. So how in the hell do you get it in the air? Well, you use the rudder, right? With a tail dragger, with a tricycle gear, that wheel up front does wonders in stabilizing the airplane. Now we can take off and really kind of abuse the throttle, maybe take a little bit of rudder compensation, and the thing will take off usually just fine. With a tail dragger, and that's why some people hate to fly tail draggers, everything's working against you. And that's where it's really important to do a couple of things. Number one, whether it's a tail dragger or whether it's a tricycle gear, come into the throttle gently. We have a runway over there that's substantially long. It's 646 feet long, and the runway here is substantially long. So, we paid for it, so take advantage of it. Roll the plane out slowly, ease up that throttle so you get some ground speed. And when you're getting to the point that you're almost flying on the ground, or maybe even flying on the ground, then you can lift off gently and make a nice scale type of takeoff. Especially with a tail dragger, it's especially important to come into the throttle very slowly to get some ground speed, so we get to the point where the rudder now starts to control our left and right, and the tail wheel is basically kind of lifting off the ground. And when the tail dragger starts to lift off the ground, again, we got to take into effect this gyro force that we talked about, and the other force is going to be added to that. So we're going to be especially gentle, and that's a especially critical point in the tail dragger. We start to get to the point where we're going to lift that tail off the ground. Be very gentle with the throttle. And now, as we ease into the throttle, the plane is basically flying now on the mains. Our rudder now controls our direction. We can hold that center line, and we can pull out into a very gentle exit of the runway. So we covered getting off the ground, but it's not over yet. Because remember that P factor thing? If we're flying along and all of a sudden we crank the elevator and we jam the throttle, we multiply those effects again, and you've all seen it. The plane comes off the runway a little early, we cram the throttle, the nose goes up in the air, it goes right, and we make a 4-point landing. Wingtip, motor, wingtip, and rudder. That's the classic tip stall. And that's exactly what happens. We forced the throttle so that we've increased that rotational factor. We've yanked the elevator, so now we've got one side of the propeller giving us a lot more thrust than the other side of the propeller. So the plane comes off, jumps up in the air, drops to the wing, and cartwheels on the ground. So whether it's a tail dragger or whether it's a tricycle gear, that effect now is the same because everything is off the ground. We have no nose wheel steering, we have no tail wheel steering, but we have our flight effects. So if you do the same thing with a tricycle gear, bring off a little early, jam the throttle, pop it up into the sky, we go into a stall, all the forces take effect, we roll left, and we cartwheel off the ground. So in the whole process of taking off, very important, tricycle gear or tail dragger, ease into the throttle, get yourself a line on the runway where you feel comfortable with, keep crowding the throttle a little bit where you're picking up speed. When you're at the point where you're almost flying, gently lift off with the elevator, make a nice exit off the runway. And you'll have success every time in taking off, whether it's a tail dragger or whether it's a tricycle gear. So that gets us in the air. Any questions about where we've gone so far? Really, there's 4 factors that really apply to every takeoff, and apply to while we're in the air too. And a lot of it comes down to just getting a feel for the airplane, how it handles, and just training your thumbs how to react to that. But be very aware of the fact that whether it's a tricycle gear, or especially if it's a tail dragger, be prepared to lean on that right rudder to keep it going down the center of the runway, and don't try to fly the airplane until you've got some decent ground speed, which relates into airspeed, which gives you plenty of lift so you can lift off gently and just exit the runway. Make sense? Mm-hmm. These are all the things that are kind of happening to us. So again, somebody made a comment about, well, how did the thing ever fly, right? There's lots of stuff going on. So that's one of the things. This hobby's not easy. It takes a while to learn how to fly airplanes. And after a while, you get easier and easier with it, and things become natural, and you kind of forget about what you're doing, and your thumb just kind of takes over, and you just go fly. And that's when you're having fun. Once you get in the air, now we're talking about several things that are going to happen as far as using that rudder. Wind correction is probably one of the biggest issues, and that occurs on takeoff and landing. Once you're in the air, you can easily get blown in or out with the wind, and oftentimes we'll just do an aileron correction to come back in or to go back out to fight that wind. Using the rudder is really easy to do that correction as well. If the wind is blowing us out, we just kick in a little rudder and we basically yaw across the field into the wind. Make our turn, we'll go back the other direction. Use that rudder to adjust our line so that we're basically traveling straight down the runway, parallel to the runway, but our airplane is yawed. And that way we're not moving left or right, and we've got a pretty consistent line. If we try to trim our airplane using the ailerons into the wind, we're going to fly in, and then we've got to come back and fly out. Then we've got to come in and fly out again. Then we've got to come back in and fly out and come back and forth on the wind. But using the rudder, you can just kind of keep that airplane flat and fly a straight line. Turning around, you use rudder the other direction and do the same thing. We've got one of the things that's really fun to do, and once you kind of play with it a little bit, is the stall turn. And almost any airplane can perform a stall turn. Super Cubs to high performance airplanes. And basically all we're doing there is getting a reasonable speed across the box or across the airplane field, and then we're going to pull to the vertical, and depending upon the weight to power ratio, the plane's going to go up a little ways or it's just kind of going to stall. But you're going to get to a point where you can kind of come off the throttle a little bit to the point where the airplane's no longer going up. Now it's in a stall position. Once it gets to that point, you crank that rudder, the plane just pivot right around, come right back down again. And the key there is to keep the airplane flying to the point where it's just still trying to climb but almost ready to stall, and then kick that rudder and let it come back on down. The common problems in making the stall turn is that if we go up and kill the throttle, now we've stopped all airflow across the rudder. Now the airplane drops out of sight, and you have to crank up the propeller again to get some airflow, and then you kind of flop over. So when you practice that, what you might want to do is to go ahead and come up on your vertical, and keep going, and then hit the rudder while you're going up, and just kind of turn over the top. And practice that, and just kind of fly over the top. And when you kind of get the feel of it, then you can come up and kind of let it stall and make that turn a little bit shorter, and a little bit shorter. And I've seen some of the guys, and I really can't do it, some of the guys can take that thing up, and with a combination of the rudder, a little bit of elevator, and the aileron, they can spin that airplane on the center of gravity and come right back down the same line that they went up. Really pretty when they do that. I haven't seen many people pull that off, but it's really a pretty maneuver when you can do that one.
Because of the forces on the motor, is it always to the right, or can you go to the left too?
Usually it's a question of where's the wind.
Oh, okay.
And that's a good question, because typically, if the wind is blowing this way, I'm much better to hammer into the wind. It's much easier to do that because I've got, you know, my motor force blowing on my rudder. I've got the wind blowing on my rudder, so it's easier to spin the aircraft. You can hammer the other direction, and it's just a question of, you know, where you're at as far as the flying field and where the wind is and what you want to do with it. But I say, just go out and try it. You can do this. Any airplane, just fly up, hit the rudder, see what happens. Fly over the top, and try to bring in a little bit, and you'll be able to make that nice, pretty stall turn. I've seen, I don't know if you've seen Bill Adams fly a Super Cub. He's got like a 120-some-inch Super Cub, and he can take that thing and put it through its paces. He can take that Cub up. It's the prettiest stall turn you've ever seen. A Super Cub. You wouldn't think this would be a very aerodynamic airplane as far as doing aerobatics, but it's just up, over the top, and right back down again. Flat turns and knife edges we'll talk a little bit more about next week. But basically you can do the same thing. You can put a mix in your radio to make that easier. Typically when you try to do just a turn with the rudder, if you do a severe turn, the plane's going to drop and the plane's going to roll. Almost any plane will do that. Do the other direction, the plane will drop and the plane will roll. So if you want to execute a larger rudder turn, you can program in a mix so that when you get the rudder, you program a little up elevator and a little opposite aileron, and then when you hit that rudder with the mix on, the plane just turns. It turns the other direction. And it's each airplane is a little different. Obviously, it's how you add that mix, but that's just something. It's basically an experiment. You know, if you have some history, I'll put in so many points of elevator, so many points of adverse aileron. Go up and try it. And I always put it on switch, so I can switch in the mix, make it active, try it. If things are really screwed up, I can switch off that mix and keep it back kind of neutral. But we'll talk more about that next week. And if you want to, we can take a look at some of your radios and see if we can program in some mixes and just kind of play with it. I programmed a little mix into this one, so when we fly this a little bit, I'll kind of show you the difference as to how the airplane behaves without any mix and how the airplane behaves with a little mix put into that. Knife edge is fun. Same kind of thing. This takes a fair amount of rudder to do that, but basically we're just trying to fly the airplane on the edge, and that's all pretty much rudder. Now most airplanes, when you try to do that without any mix, are usually going to pull to the canopy a little bit, and they're going to roll one way or the other. A high winger like this one is really pretty difficult to trim out because it doesn't like to fly on its side because of the unequal proportion of the wing on the top of the airplane versus the middle of the airplane. So typically the airplanes you're going to see in competition are doing knife edge type maneuvers. The wing is somewhere on the middle, or maybe even down below the bottom. It actually works fairly well with a like a Super Sportster or You-Can-Do or something like that, where the wing is a bottom mount. But the top wing, with the aerodynamics of that, it just doesn't like being on knife edge. It takes a lot of mix to do it, but it does work. And it's kind of fun to see this thing fly around on a knife edge. When we're in the air, and if you're pulling an arc or a curve, when I talk about you know, looking at executing aerodynamic maneuvers or aerobatic maneuvers, there's only two components to an aerobatic maneuver: straight lines and curves. And you put straight lines and curves together and you get all sorts of combinations of figures. Loops and half loops and 5/8 loops and quarter loops and 45 lines and vertical lines and whatever. But so everything you see in competition, whether it's IMAC or whether it's the electric pattern planes, it's all just a combination of lines and curves. Well, if you remember the P effect we talked about, if I'm flying along in the air and all of a sudden I pull a tight radius curve, what happens? My airplane's going this way and I change the pitch. I still got that P factor and it wants to pull me to the left. So you're going to see guys in competition almost all the time when you're pulling the big loops, or the tight radius loop, you're always playing with that left rudder because the plane's going to want to edge right on you because of your pulling. My plane's going this way, I change the pitch of the prop, it wants to force my airplane to the left. So when you're pulling that big loop, or even a short loop, you're going to find the guys feathering that right rudder just a little bit. And that becomes a question of feel and the airplane. And some people I know will set up a mix that whenever they pull the elevator, it feeds in a little bit of rudder so that they have a radius curve that they typically like to fly, and they like to duplicate that every time. So they know if they pull the elevator to fly the particular radius, it automatically mixes in a certain amount of rudder, and it keeps my airplane on track so that I don't go in or out when I'm flying that maneuver. So lots of tricks you can play with the radio. And mixing is a lot of fun because you can do a lot of things with the airplanes that just let the computer take over, and then you just run the thumbs and it works just fine. As far as the throttle control, when I'm flying my larger airplanes, I run 2 timers. I have 1 timer on my radar that times the amount of time that my throttle is engaged, or my left stick is engaged, not 0. And the other one is just strictly elapsed time. So I'm flying around and I'm doing loops, or I'm doing vertical maneuvers and coming down on a line or coming down on a 45-degree line. Almost any time when I'm losing elevation, my throttle's at 0. I'm letting gravity be my friend and just pull the line down, pull the vertical line down, fly the top of the loop, kill the power, let gravity take me over the backside of the loop, come back into the power. So if I look at that difference, my throttle time on my gas tank is about 11.5 minutes, and my flight time is 15 to 16 minutes. So 20, 30, as much as 40% of the time in the air, my throttle's at 0, and I'm not burning any gasoline. So anytime you're doing a maneuver, when you're losing altitude or you're drawing a loop and you're on the backside of the loop, kill the throttle, let the gravity take over, save gasoline, save batteries, and save your motor. In doing so, during a flight, one of the worst things you can do to a gasoline or a glow motor or an electric motor is crank it up to a high RPM and leave it there. You take off, fly around in circles at full throttle. When the time goes up, cut the throttle and land. You're never giving the engine a chance to breathe and to cool. One of the things that you're accomplishing by getting off the throttle anytime you're having gravity take over is the engine is now at 0. It's basically not taking up current, not producing heat, it's not sucking gasoline, it's not igniting in your chamber, not producing heat, so the motor has a chance to cool. So that whole process, heat the motor, cool the motor, heat the motor, cool the motor, heat the motor, cool the motor. The motors love that, and also electric planes love that, because if you can give that battery a chance to give you a big shot of current when you're full power going up, and then let the battery relax when you're not drawing any current coming down, you're basically expanding the dynamic range of that battery. You're giving it the ability to, when you crank the throttle, you're going to get more current surge, and then when you get off the throttle, the battery's going to have a chance to cool. You're probably going to find that you're going to get more power out of the battery, you're getting longer life out of the battery, and it will puff much less. Because typically the problem with puffing a battery is too much current for too long a period of time, battery gets hot, battery puffs up, and then you've destroyed some of the dynamic range of the battery. It's never really the same. It's never really going to come back. But if you're being careful with throttle management, making sure that part of your flight, you're completely out of the throttle, letting gravity take over, you're giving the battery a break, you're expanding the life of the battery, and you're giving the engine a break and extending the life of the engine as well. So very important from a throttle standpoint to be conscious about, be conservative on the throttle, and to save your batteries and save your engines. Any questions or comments or things that you had, anything that you wanted to do particularly with today's session? We're going to fire this thing up a little bit, and I'll fly a couple things to show you what I'm doing about taxiing down the runway and doing some of the mixing. But in general, that's just kind of the idea, is that there's a lot of forces acting on your airplane, and many of those forces we accelerate by being too aggressive with the throttle and not allowing the plane basically to fly itself. That's all I've got for this part of the session. I will power up and we'll go over there and give me about 10 or 15 minutes,
Excellent.
I'll go do a little flying.
Thank
So
you.
any questions? You know, I'm out here usually Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Fridays, and sometimes on Saturdays like this when doing anything. If I'm here, or if any of the board members are here, or any of the guys, you know, please tap on our shoulders. We're happy to look at radios and play with mixes, and you know, we're geeks like everybody else, so we enjoy playing with the hobby. Thank you very much for coming. And again, if I can get that sheet back, I will email you some of the information that we went over today.